4. Alert. When Arthur Manchek stepped into the small soundproofed booth and sat down before the telephone, he knew exactly what he was going to do, but he was not very sure why he was doing it. As one of the senior scoop officers, he had received a briefing nearly a year before on Project Wildfire. It had been given Manchek, remembered, by a short little man with a dry, precise way of speaking. He was a university professor, and he had outlined the project. Manchek had forgotten the details, except that there was a laboratory somewhere, and a team of 5 scientists who could be alerted to man the laboratory. The functions of the team was investigations of possible extraterrestrial life forms introduced on American spacecraft returning to Earth. Manchek had not been told who the 5 men were. He knew only that a special Defense Department trunk line existed for calling them out. In order to hook into the line, one had only to dial the binary of some number. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his wallet, then fumbled for a moment until he found the card he had been given by the professor. In case of fire, notify Divisions 87, emergencies only. He stared at the card and wondered what exactly would happen if he dialed the binary of 87. He tried to imagine the sequence of events. Who would he talk to? Would someone call him back? Would there be an inquiry, a referral to higher authority? He rubbed his eyes and stared at the card, and finally he shrugged. One way or the other, he would find out. He tore a sheet of paper from the pad in front of him, next to the telephone, and wrote 2021222324252627. This was the basis of the binary system, base to raise to some power. 2 to the 0 power was 1. 2 to the first was 2. 2 squared was 4, and so on. Manchek quickly wrote another line beneath. 201, 212, 224, 238, 2416, 2532, 2664, 27128. Then he began to add up the numbers to get a total of 87. He circled these numbers: 1, 2, 4, 16, 64. And then he drew in the binary code. Binary numbers were designed for computers which utilize an on-off yes-no kind of language. A mathematician once joked that binary numbers were the way people who have only 2 fingers count. In essence, binary numbers translated normal numbers, which require 9 digits and decimal places, to a system that depended on only two digits, 1 and 0. 201 is 1, 212 is 1, 224 1, 2380, 2416 1, 2532 0, 2664 1, 27128-0. Manchek looked at the number he had just written and inserted the dashes 1 to 110-1010, a perfectly reasonable telephone number. Manchek picked up the telephone and dialed. The time was exactly 12 midnight. Day 2, Piedmont. 5. The early hours. The machinery was there. The cables, the codes, the teleprinters had all been waiting dormant for 2 years. It only required Manchek's call to set the machinery in motion. When he finished dialing, he heard a series of mechanical clicks, and then a low hum, which meant he knew that the call was being fed into one of the scrambled trunk lines. After a moment, the humming stopped, and a voice said, "This is a recording. State your name and your message, and hang up. Major Arthur Manchek, Vandenberg Air Force Base. Scoop Mission Control. I believe it is necessary to call up on a wildfire alert. I have confirmatory visual data at this post, which has just been closed for security reasons." As he spoke, it occurred to him that it was all rather improbable. Even the tape recorder would disbelieve him. He continued to hold the telephone in his hand, somehow expecting an answer, but there was none. Only a click as the connection was automatically broken. The line was dead. He hung up and sighed. It was all very unsatisfying. Manchek expected to be called back within a few minutes by Washington. He expected to receive many calls in the next few hours, and so remained at the phone. Yet he received no calls, for he did not know that the process he had initiated was automatic. Once mobilized, the wildfire alert would proceed ahead, and not be recalled for at least 12 hours. Within 10 minutes of Manchek's call, the following message clattered across the scrambled maximum security cable units of the nation. Unit. Top secret. Code follows. AAS CBW 9-9-234-435-6778-90. Polg coordinates Delta 8997. Message follows as wildfire alert has been called. Repeat, wildfire alert has been called. Coordinates to read NASA, AMC, NSC comb deck. Time of command to read LL 5907 on date. Further notations as press blackface. Potential directive 7L2. Alert status until further notice. End message. Disengage. This was an automatic cable. Everything about it, including the announcement of a press blackout and a possible directive 712, was automatic, and it followed from Manchek's call. 5 minutes later, there was a second cable which named the men on the wildfire team. Unit. Top secret. Code follows. As CBW 9-9-234-435 678 900. Message follows as: the following male American citizens are being placed on Z Kappa status. Previous top secret clearance has been confirmed. The names are Stone Jeremy, 81, Levitt Peter, 04, Barton Charles, 51. Crichton cancel this line. Cancel this line can to read as Cook Crichton, 142. Hall Mark, 177. Accord these men Z Kappa status until further notice. End message. End message. In theory, this cable was also quite routine. Its purpose was to name the 5 members who were being given Z Kappa status, the code for OK status. Unfortunately, however, the machine misprinted one of the names and failed to reread the entire message. Normally, when one of the printout units of a secret trunk line miswrote part of a message, the entire message was rewritten, or else it was reread by the computer to certify its corrected form. The message was thus open to doubt. In Washington and elsewhere, a computer expert was called in to confirm the accuracy of the message by what is called reverse tracing. The Washington expert expressed grave concern about the validity of the message, since the machine was printing out other minor mistakes, such as L when it meant I. The upshot of all this was that the first 2 names on the list were accorded status, while the rest were not, pending confirmation. Alison Stone was tired at her home in the hills overlooking the Stanford campus. She and her husband, the chairman of the Stanford Bacteriology Department, had held a party for 15 couples, and everyone had stayed late. Mrs. Stone was annoyed. She had been raised in official Washington, where 1 second cup of coffee, offered pointedly without cognac, was accepted as a signal to go home. Unfortunately, she thought, academics do not follow the rules. She had served the 2nd cup of coffee hours ago, and everybody was still there. Shortly before 1 a.m., the doorbell rang. Answering it, she was surprised to see 2 military men standing side by side in the night. They seemed awkward and nervous to her, and she assumed they were lost. People often got lost driving through these residential areas at night. "May I help you? I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am," one said politely. "But is this the residence of Dr. Jeremy Stone?" "Yes," she said, frowning slightly. "It is." She looked beyond the 2 men to the driveway. A blue military sedan was parked there. Another man was standing by the car. He seemed to be holding something in his hand. "Does that man have a gun?" she said. "Ma'am," the man said, "we must see Dr. Stone at once, please." It all seemed strange to her, and she found herself frightened. She looked across the lawn and saw a 4th man moving up to the house and looking into the window. In the pale light streaming out onto the lawn, she could distinctly see the rifle in his hands. "What's going on?" "Ma'am, we don't want to disturb your party. Please call Dr. Stone to the door. I don't know if, otherwise, we will have to go get him," the man said. She hesitated a moment, then said, "Wait here." She stepped back and started to close the door. But one man had already slipped into the hall. He stood near the door, erect and very polite, with his hat in his hand. "I'll just wait here, ma'am," he said, and smiled at her. She walked back to the party, trying to show nothing to the guests. Everyone was still talking and laughing. The room was noisy and dense, with smoke. She found Jeremy in a corner, in the midst of some argument about riots. She touched his shoulder, and he disengaged himself from the group. "I know this sounds funny," she said, "but there is some kind of army man in the hall, and another outside, and 2 others with guns out on the lawn. They say they want to see you." For a moment, Stone looked surprised, and then he nodded. "I'll take care of it," he said. His attitude annoyed her. He seemed almost to be expecting it. "Well, if you knew about this, you might have told—" "I didn't," he said. "I'll explain later." He walked out to the hallway, where the officer was still waiting. She followed her husband. Stone said, "I am Dr. Stone." "Captain Morton," the man said. He did not offer to shake hands. "There's a fire, sir." "All right," Stone said. He looked down at his dinner jacket. "Do I have time to change?" "I'm afraid not, sir." To her astonishment, Allison saw her husband nod quietly. "All right." He turned to her and said, "I've got to leave." His face was blank and expressionless, and it seemed to her like a nightmare. His face like that, while he spoke. She was confused and afraid. "When will you be back?" "I'm not sure. A week or 2. Maybe longer." She tried to keep her voice low, but she couldn't help it. She was upset. "What is it?" she said. "Are you under arrest?" "No," he said, with a slight smile. "It's nothing like that. Make my apologies to everyone, will you? But the guns—" "Mrs. Stone," the military man said, "it's our job to protect your husband. From now on, nothing must be allowed to happen to him." "That's right," Stone said. "You see, I'm suddenly an important person." He smiled again, an odd, crooked smile, and gave her a kiss. And then, almost before she knew what was happening, he was walking out the door with Captain Morton on one side of him and the other man on the other. The man with the rifle wordlessly fell into place behind them. The man by the car saluted and opened the door. Then the car lights came on, and the doors slammed shut, and the car backed down the drive and drove off into the night. She was still standing by the door when one of her guests came up behind her and said, "Allison, are you all right?" And she turned and found she was able to smile and say, "Yes, it's nothing." Jeremy had to leave, The lab called him. Another one of his late night experiments going wrong. The guest nodded and said, "Shame. It's a delightful party." In the car, Stone sat back and stared at the men. He recalled that their faces were blank and expressionless. He said, "What have you got for me?" "Got, sir?" "Yes, damn it. What did they give you for me?" "They must have given you something." "Oh, yes, sir." He was handed a slim file. Stenciled on the brown cardboard cover was "Project Summary, Scoop." "Nothing else?" Stone said. "No, sir." Stone sighed. He had never heard of Project Scoop before. The file would have to be read carefully, but it was too dark in the car to read. There would be time for that later. On the airplane, he found himself thinking back over the last 5 years. Back to the rather odd symposium on Long Island, and the rather odd little speaker from England who had, in his own way, begun it all. In the summer of 1962, J.J. Merrick, the English biophysicist, presented a paper to the 10th Biological Symposium at Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island. The paper was entitled "Frequencies of Biologic Contact According to Speciation Probabilities." Merrick was a rebellious, unorthodox scientist whose reputation for clear thinking was not enhanced by his recent divorce, or the presence of the handsome blonde secretary he had brought with him to the symposium. Following the presentation of his paper, there was a little serious discussion of Merrick's ideas, which was summarized at the end of the paper. "I must conclude that the first contact with extraterrestrial life will be determined by the known probabilities of speciation. It is an undeniable fact that complex organisms are rare on Earth, while simple organisms flourish in abundance. There are millions of species of bacteria and thousands of species of insects. There are only a few species of primates and only 4 of great apes. There is but one species of man. With this frequency of speciation goes a corresponding frequency in numbers. Simple creatures are much more common than complex organisms. There are 3 billion men on the earth, and that seems a great many until we consider that 10 or even 100 times that number of bacteria can be contained within a large flask. All available evidence on the origins of life points to an evolutionary progression from simple to complex life forms. This is true on Earth. It is probably true throughout the universe. Shapley, Moreau, and others have calculated the number of viable planetary systems in the near universe. My own calculations indicated earlier in the paper consider the relative abundance of different organisms throughout the universe. My aim has been to determine the probability of contact between man and another life form. That probability is as follows. Form probability. Unicellular organisms or less. Naked genetic information 0.7840. Multicellular organisms simple 0.1940. Multicellular organisms complex but lacking coordinated central nervous system 0.0140. Multicellular organisms with integrated organ systems including nervous system 0.0078. Multicellular organisms with complex nervous system capable of handling 7 plus data human capabilities 0.0002 over 1.0000. These considerations led me to believe that the first human interactions with extraterrestrial life will consist of contact with organisms similar to, if not identical to, Earth, bacteria or viruses. The consequences of such contact are disturbing when one recalls that 3% of all Earth bacteria are capable of exerting some deleterious effect upon man. Later, Mirak himself considered the possibility that the first contact would consist of a plague brought back from the moon by the first men to go there. This idea was received with amusement by the assembled scientists. One of the few who took it seriously was Jeremy Stone. At the age of 36, Stone was perhaps the most famous person attending the symposium that year. He was professor of bacteriology at Stanford, a post he had held since he was 30, and he had just won the Nobel Prize. The list of Stone's achievements, disregarding the particular series of experiments that led to the Nobel Prize, is astonishing. In 1955, he was the first to use the technique of multiplicative counts for bacterial colonies. In 1957, he developed a method for liquid pure suspension. In 1960, Stone presented a radical new theory of operon activity in E. coli and S. tabuli, and developed evidence for the physical nature of the inducer and repressor substances. His 1958 paper on linear viral transformations opened broad new lines of scientific inquiry, particularly among the Pasteur Institute group in Paris, which subsequently won the Nobel Prize in 1966. In 1961, Stone himself won the Nobel Prize. The award was given for work on bacterial mutant reversions that he had done in his spare time as a law student at Michigan when he was 26. Perhaps the most significant thing about Stone was that he had done Nobel caliber work as a law student, for it demonstrated the depth and range of his interests. A friend once said to him, "Jeremy knows everything, and is fascinated by the rest." Already he was being compared to Einstein and to Bohr as a scientist with a conscience. An overview and appreciation of the significance of events. Physically, Stone was a thin, balding man with a prodigious memory that cataloged scientific facts and blue jokes with equal facility. But his most outstanding characteristics was a sense of impatience, the feeling he conveyed to everyone around him that they were wasting his time. He had a bad habit of interrupting speakers and finishing conversations, a habit he tried to control with only limited success. His imperious manner, when added to the fact that he had won the Nobel Prize at an early age, as well as the scandals of his private life. He was 4 times married, twice to the wives of colleagues, did nothing to increase his popularity. Yet it was Stone who, in the early 1960s, moved forward in government circles as one of the spokesmen for the new scientific establishment. He himself regarded this role with tolerant amusement, a vacuum eager to be filled with hot gas, he once said, but in fact his influence was considerable. By the early 1960s, America had reluctantly come to realize that it possessed, as a nation, the most potent scientific complex in the history of the world. 80% of all scientific discoveries in the preceding 3 decades had been made by Americans. The United States had 75% of the world's computers and 90% of the world's lasers. The United States had 3.5 times as many scientists as the Soviet Union and spent 3.5 times as much money on research. The US had 4 times as many scientists as the European Economic Community and spent 7 times as much on research. Most of this money came directly or indirectly from Congress, and Congress felt a great need for men to advise them on how to spend it. During the 1950s, all the great advisors had been physicists. Teller and Oppenheimer, and Bruckmann and Reidner. But 10 years later, with more money for biology and more concern for it, a new group emerged led by D. Bakery in Houston, Farmer in Boston, Hegeman in New York, and Stone in California. Stone's prominence was attributable to many factors: the prestige of the Nobel Prize, his political contacts, his most recent wife, the daughter of Senator Thomas Rain of Indiana, his legal training. All this combined to assure Stone's repeated appearance before confused Senate subcommittees, and gave him the power of any trusted advisor. It was this same power that he used so successfully to implement the research and construction leading to wildfire. Stone was intrigued by Merrick's ideas, which paralleled certain concepts of his own. He explained these in a short paper entitled Sterilizations of Spacecraft, printed in Science and later reprinted in the British journal Nature. The argument stated that bacterial contamination was a two-edged sword, and that man must protect against both edges. Previous to Stone's paper, most discussions of contamination dealt with the hazards to other planets of satellites and probes inadvertently carrying Earth organisms. This problem was considered early in the American space effort. By 1959, NASA had set strict regulations for sterilizations of Earth origin probes. The object of these regulations was to prevent contamination of other worlds. Clearly, if a probe were being sent to Mars or Venus to search for new life forms, it would defeat the purpose of the experiment for the probe to carry Earth bacteria with it. Stone considered the reverse situation. He stated that it was equally possible for extraterrestrial organisms to contaminate the Earth via space probes. He noted that spacecraft that burned up in re-entry presented no problem, but live returns, manned flights, and probes such as the Scoop satellites were another matter entirely. Here, he said, the questions of contaminations was very great. His paper created a brief flurry of interests, but as he later said, nothing very spectacular. Therefore, in 1963, he began an informal seminar group that met thrice monthly in room 410 on the top floor of the Stanford Medical School biochemistry wing for lunch and discussions of the contaminations problem. It was this group of 5 men, Stone and John Black of Stanford, Samuel Holden and Terence Lassett of Cal Med, and Andrew Rice of Berkeley Biophysics, that eventually formed the early nucleus of the Wildfire Project. They presented petitions to the president in 1965, in a letter consciously patterned after the Einstein letter to Roosevelt in 1940 concerning the atomic bomb. Stanford University, Palo Alto, California, June 10, 1965. The President of the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. President, recent theoretical considerations suggest that sterilization procedures of returning space probes may be inadequate to guarantee sterile re-entry to this planet's atmosphere. The consequence of this is the potential introductions of virulent organisms into the present terrestrial ecologic framework. It is our belief that sterilizations for re-entry probes and manned capsules can never be wholly satisfactory. Our calculations suggest that even if capsules received sterilization procedures in space, the probability of contaminations would still remain 1 in 10,000, and perhaps much more. These estimates are based upon organized life as we know it. Other forms of life may be entirely resistant to our sterilization methods. We therefore urge the establishment of a facility designed to deal with an extraterrestrial life form, should one inadvertently be introduced to the Earth. The purpose of this facility would be twofold: to limit dissemination of the life form and to provide laboratories for its investigations and analysis, with a view to protecting Earth lifeforms from its influence. We recommend that such a facility be located in an uninhabited region of the United States that is be constructed underground, that it incorporates all known isolations techniques, and that it be equipped with a nuclear device for self-destruction in the eventuality of an emergency. So far as we know, no form of life can survive the 2 million degrees of heat which accompanied an atomic nuclear detonations. Yours very truly, Jeremy Stone, John Black, Samuel Holden, Terence Lissett, Andrew Rice. Response to the letter was gratifyingly prompt. 24 hours later, Stone received a call from one of the president's advisors, and the following day he flew to Washington to confer with the president and members of the National Security Council. 2 weeks after that, he flew to Houston's to discuss further plans with NASA officials. Although Stone recalls 1 or 2 cracks about the goddamn penitentiary for bugs, most scientists he talked with regarded the project favorably. Within a month, Stone's informal team was hardened into an official committee to study problems of contaminations and draw up recommendations. This committee was put on the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects list and funded through the Defense Department. At that time, the ARPL was heavily invested in chemistry and physics, ion sprays, reversal duplications, Python substrates, but there was growing interest in biologic problems. Thus, one ARPL group was concerned with electronic pacing of brain functions, a euphemism for mind control. A second had prepared a study of biosynergics, the future possible combinations of man and machines, implanted inside the body. Still, another was evaluating Project Ozma, the search for extraterrestrial life conducted in 1961-4. A fourth group was engaged in preliminary design of a machine that would carry out all human functions and would be self-duplicating. All these projects were highly theoretical, and all was staffed by prestigious scientists. Admission to the ARPL was a mark of considerable status, and it ensured future funds for implementations and development. Therefore, when Stone's committee submitted an early draft of the life analysis protocol, which detailed the way any living things could be studied, the Defense Department responded with an outright appropriations of $22 million for the construction of a special isolated laboratory. This rather large sum was felt to be justified, since the project had applications to other studies already underway. In 1965, the whole field of sterility and contaminations was one of major importance. For example, NASA was building a lunar receiving laboratory, a high-security facility for Apollo astronauts returning from the moon and possibly carrying bacteria or viruses harmful to man. Every astronaut returning from the moon would be quarantined in the LRL for 3 weeks until decontamination was complete. Further, the problems of clean rooms of industry where dust and bacteria were kept at a minimum, and the sterile chambers under study at Bethesda were also major, as septic environments, life islands, and sterile support systems seemed to have great future significance, and Stone's appropriations was considered a good investment in all these fields. Once money was funded, constructions proceeded rapidly. The eventual result, the Wildfire Laboratory, was built in 1966 in Flat Rock, Nevada. Design was awarded to the naval architects of the electric boat divisions of General Dynamics, since GD had considerable experience designing living quarters on atomic submarines where men had to live and work for prolonged periods. The plan consisted of a conical underground structure with 5 floors. Each floor was circular, with a central service core of wiring, plumbing, and elevators. Each floor was more sterile than the one above. The first floor was non-sterile, the second moderately sterile, the third stringently sterile, and so on. Passage from one floor to another was not free. Personnel had to undergo decontaminations and quarantine procedures in passing either up or down. Once the laboratory was finished, it only remained to select the Wildfire Alert Team, the group of scientists who would study any new organisms. After a number of studies of team compositions, 5 men were selected, including Jeremy Stone himself. These 5 were prepared to mobilize immediately in the event of a biological emergency. Barely 2 years after his letter to the president, Stone was satisfied that this country has the capability to deal with an unknown biologic agent. He professed himself pleased with the response of Washington and the speed with which his ideas had been implemented. But privately, he admitted to friends that it had been almost too easy, that Washington had agreed to his plans almost too readily. Stone could not have known the reasons behind Washington's eagerness, or the very real concern many government officials had for the problem. For Stone knew nothing until the night he left the party and drove off in the blue military sedan of Project Scoop. "It was the fastest thing we could arrange, sir," the army man said. Stone stepped onto the airplane, with a sense of absurdity. It was a Boeing 727, completely empty, the seats stretching back in long, unbroken rows. "Sit first class, if you like," the army man said, with a slight smile. "It doesn't matter." A moment later, he was gone. He was not replaced by a stewardess, but by a stern MP with a pistol on his hip, who stood by the door as the engine started, whining softly in the night. Stone sat back with a scoop file in front of him and began to read. It made fascinating reading. He went through it quickly, so quickly that the MP thought his passenger must be merely glancing at the file. But Stone was reading every word. Scoop was the brainchild of Major General Thomas Sparks, head of the Army Medical Corps, Chemical and Biological Warfare Division. Sparks was responsible for the research of the CBW installations at Fort Detrick, Maryland, Hawley, Indiana, and Dugway, Utah. Stone had met him once or twice, and remembered him as being mild-mannered and bespectacled, not the sort of man to be expected in the job he held. Reading on, Stone learned that Project Scoop was contracted to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory of the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena in 1963. Its avowed aim was the collection of any organisms that might exist in near space, the upper atmosphere of the Earth. Technically speaking, it was an Army project, but it was funded through the National Aeronautics and Space Administrations, a supposedly civilian organization. In fact, NASA was a government agency with a heavy military commitment. 43% of its contractual work was classified in 1963. In theory, JPL was designing a satellite to enter the fringes of space and collect organisms and dust for study. This was considered a project of pure science, almost curiosity, and was thus accepted by all the scientists working on the study. In fact, the true aims were quite different. The true aims of Scoop were to find new life forms that might benefit the Fort Detrick program. In essence, it was a study to discover new biological weapons of war. Detrick was a rambling structure in Maryland dedicated to the discovery of chemical and biological warfare weapons, covering 1,300 acres, with a physical plant valued at $100 million. It ranked as one of the largest research facilities of any kind in the United States. Only 15% of its findings were published in open scientific journals. The rest were classified, as were the reports from Hawley and Dugway. Hawley was a maximum security installations that dealt largely with viruses. In the previous 10 years, a number of new viruses had been developed there, ranging from the variety-coded Carrie-Nation, which produces diarrhea, to the variety-coded Arnold, which causes colonic seizures and death. The Dugway Proving Ground in Utah was larger than the state of Rhode Island and was used principally to test poison gases such as tabon, sclar, and Cough 11. Few Americans Stone knew were aware of the magnitude of U.S. research into chemical and biological warfare. The total government expenditure in CBW exceeded $500 million a year. Much of this was distributed to academic centers such as Johns Hopkins, Pennsylvania, and the University of Chicago, where studies of weapon systems were contracted under vague terms. Sometimes, of course, the terms were not so vague. The Johns Hopkins program was devised to evaluate studies of actual or potential injuries and illnesses, studies on diseases of potential biological warfare significance, and evaluations of certain chemical and immunological responses to certain toxoids and vaccines. In the past 8 years, none of the results from Johns Hopkins had been published openly. Those from other universities, such as Chicago and UCLA, had occasionally been published, but these were considered within the military establishment to be trial balloons, examples of ongoing research intended to intimidate foreign observers. A classic was the paper by Tendron and 5 others entitled Researchers into a Toxin Which Rapidly Uncouples Oxidative Phosphorylations through cutaneous absorptions. The paper described, but did not identify, a poison that would kill a person in less than a minute and was absorbed through the skin. It was recognized that this was a relatively minor achievement compared to other toxins that had been devised in recent years. With so much money and effort going into CBW, one might think that new and more virulent weapons would be continuously perfected. However, this was not the case from 1961 to 1965. The conclusion of the Senate Preparedness Subcommittee in 1961 was that conventional research has been less than satisfactory, and that new avenues and approaches of inquiry should be opened within the field. That was precisely what Major General Thomas Sparks intended to do with Project Scoop. In final form, Scoop was a program to orbit 17 satellites around the Earth, collecting organisms and bringing them back to the surface. Stone read the summaries of each previous flight. Scoop 1 was a gold-plated satellite, cone-shaped, weighing 37 pounds, fully equipped. It was launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base in Parisma, California. On March 12, 1966, Vandenberg is used for west-to-east orbits, as opposed to Cape Kennedy, which launches east to west. Vandenberg had the additional advantages of maintaining better secrecy than Kennedy. Scoop 1 orbited for 6 days before being brought down. It landed successfully in a swamp near Athens, Georgia. Unfortunately, it was found to contain only standard Earth organisms. Scoop 2 burned up in re-entry as a result of instrumentation's failure. Scoop 3 also burned up, though it had a new type of plastic and tungsten laminate heat shield. Scoops 4 and 5 were recovered intact from the Indian Ocean and the Appalachians foothills, but neither contained radically new organisms. Those collected were harmless variants of S. albus, a common contaminant of normal human skin. These failures led to a further increase in sterilization procedures prior to launch. Scoop 6 was launched on New Year's Day, 1967. It incorporated all the latest refinements from early attempts. High hopes rode with the revised satellite, which returned 11 days later, landing near Bombay, India. Unknown to anyone, the 34th Airborne, then stationed in Évreux, France, just outside Paris, was dispatched to recover the capsule. The 34th was on alert whenever a spaceflight went up. According to the procedures of Operation Scrub, a plan first devised to protect Mercury and Gemini capsules should one be forced to land in Soviet Russia or Eastern Bloc countries. Scrub was the primary reason for keeping a single paratroop divisions in Western Europe in the first half of the 1960s. Scoop 6 was recovered uneventfully. It was found to contain a previously unknown form of unicellular organisms, Crocopacillary in shape, gram-negative, coagulous, and triokinase positive. However, it proved generally benevolent to all living things with the exception of domestic female chickens, which it made moderately ill for a 4-day period. Among the Dietrich staff, hope dimmed for the successful recovery of a pathogen from the Scoop program. Nonetheless, Scoop 7 was launched soon after Scoop 6. The exact date is classified, but it is believed to be February 5th, 1967. Scoop 7 immediately went into stable orbit with an apogee of 317 miles and a perigee of 224 miles. It remained in orbit for 2.5 days. At that time, the satellite abruptly left stable orbit for unknown reasons, and it was decided to bring it down by radio command. The anticipated landing site was a desolate area in northeastern Arizona. Midway through the flight, his readings was interrupted by an officer who brought him a telephone, and then stepped a respectful distance away, while Stone talked. "Yes," Stone said. Feeling odd, He was not accustomed to talking on the telephone in the middle of an airplane trip. "General Marcus here," a tired voice said. "Stone did not know General Marcus. I just wanted to inform you that all members of the team have been called in, with the exception of Professor Kirk." "What happened?" "Professor Cook is in the hospital," General Marcus said. "You'll get further details when you touch down." The conversations ended. Stone gave the telephone back to the officer. He thought for a minute about the other men on the team and wondered at their reactions as they were called out of bed. There was the Leavitt, of course. He would respond quickly. Leavitt was a clinical microbiologist, a man experienced in the treatment of infectious disease. Leavitt had seen enough plagues and epidemics in his day to know the importance of quick actions. Besides, there was his ingrained pessimism, which never deserted him. Leavitt had once said at my wedding, all I could think of was how much alimony she'd cost me. He was an irritable, grumbling, heavyset man, with a morose face and sad eyes, which seemed to peer ahead into a bleak, miserable future. But he was also thoughtful, imaginative, and not afraid to think daringly. Then there was the pathologist, Burton, in Houston. Stone had never liked Burton very well, though he acknowledged his scientific talent. Burton and Stone were different. Where Stone was organized, Burton was sloppy. Where Stone was controlled, Burton was impulsive. Where Stone was confident, Burton was nervous, jumpy, petulant. Colleagues referred to Burton as the stumbler, partly because of his tendencies to trip over his untied shoelaces and baggy trousers cuffs, and partly because of his talent for tumbling by error into one important discovery after another. And then Kirk, the anthropologist from Yale, who apparently was not going to be able to come. If the report was true, Stone knew he was going to miss him. Cook was an ill-informed and rather foppish man who possessed, as if by accident, a superbly logical brain. He was capable of grasping the essentials of a problem and manipulating them to get the necessary result. Though he could not balance his own checkbook, mathematicians often came to him for help in resolving highly abstract problems. Stone was going to miss that kind of brain. Certainly, the fifth man would be no help. Stone frowned as he thought about Mark Hall. Hall had been a compromise candidate for the team. Stone would have preferred a physician with experience in metabolic disease, and the choice of a surgeon instead had been made with the greatest reluctance. There had been great pressure from defense and the AEC to accept Hall, since those groups believed in the odd man hypothesis, In the end, Stone and the others had given in. Stone did not know Hall well. He wondered what he would say when he was informed of the alert. Stone could not have known of the great delay in notifying members of the team. He did not know, for instance, that Burton the pathologist was not called until 5 a.m., or that Peter Leavitt, the microbiologist, was not called until 6:30, the time he arrived at the hospital. And Hall was not called until 5 minutes past 7. It was Mark Hall said later, a horrifying experience. In an instant, I was taken from the most familiar of worlds and plunged into the most unfamiliar. At 6:45, Hall was in the washroom adjacent to OR7, scrubbing for his first case of the day. He was in the midst of a routine he had carried out daily for several years. He was relaxed and joking with a resident, scrubbing with him. When he finished, he went into the operating room, holding his arms before him, and the instrument nurse handed him a towel to wipe his hands dry. Also in the room was another resident who was prepping the body for surgery, applying iodine and alcohol solutions, and a circulating nurse. They all exchanged greetings. At the hospital, Hall was known as a swift, quick-tempered, and unpredictable surgeon. He operated with speed, working nearly twice as fast as other surgeons. When things went smoothly, he laughed and joked as he worked, kidding his assistants, the nurses, the anesthetists. But if things did not go well, if they became slow and difficult, Hall could turn blackly irritable. Like most surgeons, he was insistent upon routine. Everything had to be done in a certain order, in a certain way. If not, he became upset. Because the others in the operating room knew this, they looked up toward the overhead viewing gallery with apprehension when Leavitt appeared. Leavitt clicked on the intercom that connected the upstairs room to the operating room below and said, "Hello, Mark." Hall had been draping the patients, placing green sterile cloths over every part of the body except for the abdomen. He looked up with surprise. "Hello, Peter," he said. "Sorry to disturb you," Leavitt said, "but this is an emergency." "Half to 8, Hall said. "I'm starting a procedure." He finished draping and called for the skin knife. He palpated the abdomen, feeling for the landmarks to begin his incisions. "It can't wait," Leavitt said. Hall paused. He set down the scalpel and looked up. There was a long silence. "What the hell do you mean, it can't wait?" Leavitt remained calm. "You'll have to break scrub. This is an emergency." "Look, Peter, I've got a patient here, anesthetized, ready to go. I can't just walk. Kelly, will take over for you. Kelly was one of the staff surgeons. Kelly? He's scrubbing now, Leavitt said. It's all arranged. I'll expect to meet you in the surgeon's change room in about 30 seconds. And then he was gone. Hall glared at everyone in the room. No one moved or spoke. After a moment, he stripped off his gloves and stomped out of the room, swearing once very loudly. Hall viewed his own associations with wildfire as tenuous at best. In 1966, he had been approached by Leavitt, the chief of bacteriology of the hospital, who had explained in a sketchy way the purpose of the project. Hall found it all rather amusing and had agreed to join the team. If his services ever became necessary, privately he was confident that nothing would ever come to wildfire. Leavitt had offered to give Hall the files on wildfire and to keep him up to date on the project. At first, Hall politely took the files, but it soon became clear that he was not bothering to read them, and so Leavitt stopped giving them to him. If anything, this pleased Hall, who preferred not to have his desk cluttered. A year before, Leavitt had asked him whether he was curious about something that he had agreed to join, and that might at some future time prove dangerous. Hall had said no. Now in the doctor's room, Hall regretted those words. The doctor's room was a small place, lined on all four walls with lockers. There were no windows. A large coffee maker sat in the center of the room, with a stack of paper cups alongside. Leavitt was pouring himself a cup, his solemn basset hound face looking mournful. "This is going to be awful coffee," he said. "You can't get a decent cup anywhere in a hospital. Hurry and change." Hall said, "Do you mind telling me first why?" I mind, Leavitt said. Change, there's a car waiting outside. And we're already late. Perhaps too late." He had a gruffly melodramatic way of speaking that had always annoyed Hall. There was a loud slurp as Leavitt sipped the coffee. Just as I suspected," he said. "How can you tolerate it? Hurry, please." Hall unlocked his locker and kicked it open. He leaned against the door and stripped away the black plastic shoe covers that were worn in the operating room to prevent buildup of static charges. "Next, I suppose you're going to tell me this has to do with that damned project." "Exactly," Leavitt said. "Now try to hurry. The car's waiting to take us to the airport. And the morning's traffic is bad." Hall changed quickly, not thinking, his mind momentarily stunned. Somehow, he had never thought it possible. He dressed and walked out with Leavitt toward the hospital entrance. Outside in the sunshine, he could see the olive U.S. Army sedan pulled up to the curb, its light flashing, and he had a sudden horrible realization that Leavitt was not kidding, that nobody was kidding, and that some kind of awful nightmare was coming true. For his own part, Peter Leavitt was irritated with Hall. In general, Leavitt had little patience with practicing physicians, though he had an M.D. degree. Leavitt had never practiced, preferring to devote his time to research. His field was clinical microbiology and epidemiology, and his specialty was parasitology. He had done parasitic research all over the world. His work had led to the discovery of the Brazilian tapeworm, Taenia renzi, which he had characterized in a paper in 1953. As he grew older, however, Leavitt had stopped traveling. Public health, he was fond of saying, was a young man's game. When you got your 5th case of intestinal amoebiasis, it was time to quit. Leavitt got his 5th case in Rhodesia in 1955. He was dreadfully sick for 3 months and lost 40 pounds. Afterward, he resigned his job in the public health service. He was offered the post of chief of microbiology at the hospital, and he had taken it with the understanding that he would be able to devote a good portion of his time to research. Within the hospital, he was known as a superb clinical bacteriologist, but his real interest remained parasites. In the period from 1955 to 1964, he published a series of elegant metabolic studies on Ascaris and Necator that were highly regarded by other workers in the field. Leavitt's reputations had made him a natural choice for wildfire, and it was through Leavitt that Hall had been asked to join. Leavitt knew the reasons behind Hall's selections, though Hall did not. When Leavitt had asked him to join, Hall had demanded to know why. I'm just a surgeon, he had said. Yes, Leavitt said, but you know electrolytes, so that may be important. Blood chemistry's pH, acidity, and alkalinity, the whole thing, that may be vital when the time comes. But there are a lot of electrolyte people, Hall had pointed out, many of them better than me. Yes, Leavitt said, but they're all married. So what? We need a single man. Why? It's necessary that one member of the team be unmarried. That's crazy, Hall had said. Maybe Leavitt had said, maybe not. They left the hospital and walked up to the army sedan. A young officer was waiting, stiffly, and saluted as they came up. Dr. Hall? Yes. May I see your card, please? Hall gave him the little plastic card with his picture on it. He had been carrying this card in his wallet for more than a year. It was a rather strange card, with just a name, a picture, and a thumbprint. Nothing more. Nothing to indicate that it was an official card. The officer glanced at it, then at Hall, and back to the card. He handed it back. Very good, sir. He opened the rear door of the sedan. Hall got in, and Leavitt followed, shielding his eyes from the flashing red light on the car top. Hall noticed it. Something wrong? No. Just never liked flashing lights. Reminds me of my days as an ambulance driver during the war. Leavitt settled back and the car started off. Now then, he said, when we reach the airfield, you will be given a file to read during the trip. What trip? You will be taking an F-104, Leavitt said. Where? Nevada. Try to read the file on the way. Once we arrive, things will be very busy. And the others in the team? Leavitt glanced at his watch. Cook has appendicitis and is in the hospital. The others have already begun work. Right now, they are in a helicopter over Piedmont, Arizona. Never heard of it, Hall said. Nobody has, Leavitt said, until now.